Petunia and their son Dudley were Harry's only living relatives. They were muggles and they had a very medieval attitude towards magic. Harry's dead parents, who had been a witch and a wizard themselves, were never mentioned under the Dursleys' roof. For years, Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had hoped that if they kept Harry as downtrodden as possible, they would be able to squash the magic out of him. To their fury, they had been unsuccessful and now lived in terror of anyone finding out that Harry had spent most of the last 2 years at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The most the Dursleys could do these days was to lock Harry's spellbooks, wand, cauldron, and broomstick at the start of the summer holidays, and forbid him to talk to the neighbors. The separation from his spellbooks had been a real problem for Harry because his teachers at Hogwarts had given him a lot of holiday work. One of the essays, a particularly nasty one about shrinking potions, was for Harry's least favorite teacher, Professor Snape, who would be delighted to have an excuse to give Harry detention for a month. Harry had therefore seized his chance in the first week of the holidays, while Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley had gone out into the front garden to admire Uncle Vernon's new company car in very loud voices so that the rest of the street could notice it too. Harry had crept downstairs, picked the lock on the cupboard under the stairs, grabbed some of his books and hidden them in his bedroom. As long as he didn't leave the spot of ink on the sheets, the Dursleys need never know that he was studying magic by night. Harry was keen to avoid trouble with his aunt and uncle at the moment, as they were already in a bad mood with him, all because he received a telephone call from a fellow wizard 1 week into the school holidays. Ron Weasley, who was one of Harry's best friends at Hogwarts, came from a whole family of wizards. This meant that he knew a lot of things that Harry didn't, but had never used a telephone before. Most unlikely, it had been Uncle Vernon who had answered the phone call. Vernon Dursley speaking. Harry, who happened to be in the room at the time, froze as he heard Ron's voice answer. Hello, hello. Can you hear me? I want to talk to Harry Potter. Ron was yelling so loudly that Uncle Vernon jumped and held the receiver a foot away from his a foot away from his ear, staring at it with an expression of mingled fury and alarm. Who is this? He roared in the direction of the mouthpiece. Who are you? Ron Weasley. Ron bellowed back as though he had Uncle Vernon. He and Uncle Vernon were speaking from opposite ends of a football pitch. I'm a friend of Harry's from school. Uncle Vernon's small eyes swiveled around to Harry, who was rooted onto the spot. There is no Harry Potter here, he roared, now holding his receiver at arm's length as though frightened it might explode. I don't know what school you're talking about. Never contact me again. Don't you come near my family. He threw the receiver back onto the telephone as if dropping a poisonous spider. The row that had followed had been one of the worst ever. How dare you give this number to people like you? Uncle Vernon had roared, spraying Harry with spit. Ron obviously realized that he'd got Harry into trouble because he hadn't called ever again. Harry's other best friend from Hogwarts, Hermione Granger, hadn't been in touch either. Harry suspected that Ron had warned Hermione not to call, which was a pity, because Hermione, the cleverest witch in Harry's year, had Muggle parents, knew perfectly well how to use a telephone, and would probably have had enough sense not to say that she went to Hogwarts. So Harry had no word from any of his wizarding friends for 5 long weeks. And this summer was turning out to be almost as bad as the last one. There was just one very small improvement. them, the largest toy female, was his own Hedwig. She too was carrying a parcel and looked extremely pleased with herself. She gave Harry an affectionate nip with her beak as he removed her burden, then flew across the room to join Errol. Harry didn't recognize the third owl, a handsome, tawny one, but he knew at once where it had come from because, in addition to a third parcel, it was carrying a letter bearing the Hogwarts crest. When Harry relieved this owl of its post, it ruffled his feathers importantly, stretched its wings, and took off through the window into the night. Harry sat down on his bed, grabbed Errol's package, ripped off the brown paper, and discovered a present wrapped in gold. And his first ever birthday card. Fingers trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. 2 pieces of paper fell out, a letter and a newspaper cutting. The cutting had clearly come out of the wizarding newspaper, the Daily Prophet, because the people in the black and white pictures were moving. Harry picked up the cutting, smoothed it out, and read, Ministry of Magic employee scoops grand prize. Arthur Weasley, head of the misuse of Muggle artifacts office at the Ministry of Magic, has won the annual Daily Prophet grand prize galleon draw. A delighted Mr. Weasley told the Daily Prophet, we will be spending the gold on a summer holiday in Egypt, where our eldest son Bill works as a curse breaker for Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The Weasley family will be spending a month in Egypt, returning for the start of the school year at Hogwarts, with 5 of the Weasley children currently attend. Harry scanned the moving photograph, and a grin spread across his face as he saw all 9 of the Weasleys waving furiously at him, standing in front of the large pyramid. Plump little Mrs. Weasley, tall, balding Mr. Weasley, 6 sons and 1 daughter, although the black and white picture didn't show it, with flaming red hair. Right in the middle of the picture was Ron, tall and gangling, with his pet rat Scabbers on his shoulder and his arm around his little sister Ginny. Harry couldn't think of anyone who deserved to win a large pile of gold more than the Weasleys, who were very nice and extremely poor. He picked up Ron's letter and unfolded it. Dear Harry, happy birthday. Look, I'm really sorry about the telephone call. I hope the Muggles didn't give you a hard time. I asked Dad, and he reckons I shouldn't have shouted. It's brilliant here in Egypt. Bill's taking us around all the tombs, and I wouldn't believe the curses those old Egyptian wizards put on them. Mom wouldn't let Ginny come in the last one. There were all these mutant skeletons in there of Muggles who'd broken and grown extra heads and stuff. I couldn't believe it when Dad won the Daily Prophet draw. 700 galleons, most of it's gone on this holiday, but they're going to buy me on holiday in France at the moment, and I didn't know how I was going to send this to you. What if they'd opened it at the customs, but then Hedwig turned up? I think she wanted to make sure you got something for your birthday for a change. I bought your present by owl order. There was an advertisement in the Daily Prophet. I've been getting it delivered. It's so good. To keep up with what's going on in the wizarding world. Did you see that picture of Ron and his family a week ago? I bet he's learning loads. I'm really jealous. The ancient Egyptian wizards are fascinating. There's something interesting. Local history of witchcraft here too. I've rewritten my home history of magic essay to include some of the things I found out. I hope it's not too long. It's 2 rolls of parchment, more than Professor Binns asked for. Ron says he's going to be in London in the last week of the holidays. Can you make it? Will your aunt and uncle let you come? I really hope you can. If not, I'll see you on the Hogwarts Express on September 1st. Love from Hermione. P.S. Ron says Percy's head boy. I'll bet Percy's really pleased. Ron doesn't seem too happy about it. Harry laughed again and he put Hermione's letter aside and picked up her present. It was very heavy. Knowing Hermione, he was sure it would be a large book full of very difficult spells. But it wasn't. His heart gave a huge bound as he ripped back the paper and saw a sleek black leather case with silver words stamped across it. Broomstick servicing kit. Wow, Hermione, Harry whispered, unzipping the case to look inside. There was a large jar of Fleetwood's high-finished handle polish, a pair of gleaming silver tail twig clippers, and a tiny brass compass to clip onto your broom for long journeys, and a handbook of do-it-yourself broom care. Apart from his friends, the things that Harry missed the most about Hogwarts was Quidditch, the most popular sport in the magical world, highly dangerous and very exciting, and played on broomsticks. Harry happened to be a very good Quidditch player. He had been the youngest person in a century to be picked for Hogwarts house teams. One of Harry's most prized possessions was his Nimbus 2000 racing broom. Harry put the leather case aside and picked up his last parcel. He recognized the untidy scrawl on the brown paper at once. This was from Hagrid, the Hogwarts gatekeeper. He tore off the top layer of the paper and glimpsed something green and leathery. But before he could unwrap it properly, the parcel gave a strange quiver, and whatever was inside it snapped loudly, as though it had jaws. Harry froze. He knew that Hagrid would never send him anything dangerous on purpose, but then Hagrid didn't have a normal person's view of what dangerous was. Hagrid had been known to befriend giant spiders, buy vicious 3-headed dogs from men in pubs, and sneak illegal more here. Tell you when I see you. Hope the muggles are treating you right. All the best. Hagrid. It struck Harry as ominous that Hagrid thought a biting book would come in useful. But he put up Hagrid's card next to Ron and Hermione's, grinning more broadly than ever. Now there was only the letter from Hogwarts left. Noticing that it was rather thicker than usual, Harry slit open the envelope, pulled out the first page of the parchment within it, and read, "Dear Mr. Potter, please note that the new school year will begin on September 1st. The Hogwarts Express will leave from King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4, at 11 o'clock. Third years are permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade at certain weekends. Please give the enclosed permission form to your parent or guardian to sign. A list of books for next year is enclosed. Yours sincerely, Professor M. McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress." Harry pulled out the Hogsmeade permission form and looked at it, no longer grinning. It would be wonderful to visit Hogsmeade at weekends. He knew it was entirely a wizarding village, and he had never set foot there. But how on earth was he going to persuade Uncle Vernon or Aunt Petunia to sign the form? He looked over at the alarm clock. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning. Deciding that he'd worry about the Hogsmeade form when he woke up, Harry got back into bed and reached up to cross off another day on the chart he'd made for himself, counting down the days left until his return to Hogwarts. Then he took off his glasses and lay down, eyes open, facing his 3 birthday cards. Extremely unusual though he was. At that moment, Harry Potter felt just like everyone else, glad, for the first time in his life, that it was his birthday. Chapter 2, Aunt Marge's Big Mistake. Harry went down to breakfast next morning to find the 3 Dursleys already sitting around the kitchen table. They were watching a brand new television, a welcome home for the summer present for Dudley, who had been complaining loudly about the long walk between the fridge and the television in the living room. Dudley had spent most of the summer in the kitchen, his piggy little eyes fixed on the screen and his 5 chins wobbling as he ate continually. Harry sat down between Dudley and Vernon, a large beefy man with very little neck and a lot of mustache. Far from wishing Harry a happy birthday, none of the Dursleys gave any sign that they had noticed Harry enter the room. But Harry was far too used to this to care. He helped himself to a piece of toast and then looked up at the newsreader on the television, who was halfway through a report on an escaped convict. The public is warned that Black is an armed and extremely dangerous. A special hotline has been set up, and any sighting of Black should be reported immediately. So no need to tell us he's no good, snorted Uncle Vernon, staring over the top of his newspaper at the prisoner. Look at the state of him, a filthy layabout. Look at his hair. He shot a nasty look sideways at Harry, whose untidy hair had always been a source of great annoyance to Uncle Vernon. Compared to the man on the television, however, whose gaunt face was surrounded by a matted elbow-length tangle, Harry felt very well groomed indeed. The newsreader had reappeared. "The Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries will announce today." "Hang on," barked Uncle Vernon, staring furiously at the newsreader. "You didn't tell us where the maniacs escaped from. What use is that? Lunatic could be coming up the street right now." Aunt Petunia, who was bony and horse-faced, whipped around and peered intently out the kitchen window. Harry knew Aunt Petunia would simply love to be the one to call the hotline number. She was the nosiest woman in the world, and spent most of her life spying on her boring, law-abiding neighbors. "When will they learn?" said Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his large purple fist, "that hanging's the only way to deal with these people." "Very true," said Aunt Petunia, who was still squinting into the Doors runner beans. Uncle Vernon drained his teacup, glanced at his watch, and added, "I'd better be off in a minute, Petunia. Marge's train gets in at 10. Harry, whose thoughts had been upstairs with the broomstick servicing kit, was brought back to earth with an unpleasant bump. "Aunt Marge," she blurted out. She's not coming here, is she?" Aunt Marge was Uncle Vernon's sister, even though he was not a blood relative of Harry's. She was not a blood relative of Harry's, whose mother had been Aunt Petunia's sister. He had been forced to call her aunt all his life. Aunt Marge lived in the country, in a house with a large garden where she bred bulldogs. She didn't offer to stay at Privet Drive because she couldn't bear to leave her precious dogs, but each of her visits stood out horribly vivid in Harry's mind. At Dudley's 5th birthday party, Aunt Marge had whacked Harry around the shins with her walking stick to stop him beating Dudley at musical statues. A few years later, she turned up at the Christmas with a computerized robot for Dudley and a box of dog biscuits for Harry. On the last visit, the year before Harry started at Hogwarts, Harry had accidentally trodden on the paw of her favorite dog. Ripper had chased Harry out into the garden and up a tree, and Aunt Marge had refused to call him off until past midnight. The memory of this incident still brought tears of laughter to Dudley's eyes. "Marge will be here for a week," Uncle Vernon snarled, and while we're on that subject, he pointed a fat finger threateningly at Harry. "We need to get a few things straight here before I go to collect her." Dudley smirked and withdrew his gaze from the television. Watching Harry being bullied by Uncle Vernon was Dudley's favorite form of entertainment. "Firstly," growled Uncle Vernon, "you'll keep a civil tongue in your head when you're talking to Marge." "All right," said Harry bitterly, "if she does when she's talking to me." "Secondly," said Uncle Vernon, acting as though he had not heard Harry's reply, "as Marge does not know anything about your abnormality, I don't want any funny stuff while she's here. You behave yourself, got me?" "I will if she does," said Harry through gritted teeth. "And thirdly," said Uncle Vernon, his mean little eyes now slits in his great purple face, "we've told Marge that you attend St. Brutus's secure center for incurably criminal boys." "What?" Harry yelled. "And you'll be sticking to that story, boy, or there'll be trouble," spat Uncle Vernon. Harry sat there white-faced and furious, staring at Uncle Vernon, hardly able to believe it. Aunt Marge coming for a week-long visit. It was the worst birthday present the Dudleys had ever given him, including that pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks. "Well, Petunia," said Uncle Vernon, getting heavily to his feet, "I'll be off to the station then. Want to come along for the ride, Butters?" "No," said Dudley, whose attention had returned to the television now that Uncle Vernon had finished threatening Harry. "Dudley's got to make himself smart for his auntie," said Aunt Petunia, smoothing Dudley's thick blonde hair. "Mommy bought him a lovely new bow tie." Uncle Vernon clapped Dudley to the on his porky shoulder. "See you in a bit then," he said, and he left the kitchen. Harry, who had been sitting in a kind of horrified trance, had a sudden idea. Abandoning his toast, he got quickly to his feet and followed Uncle Vernon to the front door. Uncle Vernon was pulling on his car coat. "I'm not taking you," he snarled as he turned to see Harry watching him. "Like I wanted to come," said Harry coldly. "I want to ask you something." Uncle Vernon eyed him suspiciously. "Third years at my school are allowed to visit the village sometimes," said Harry. "So," snapped Uncle Vernon, taking his car keys from the hook next to the door. "I need you to send the permission form," said Harry in a rush. "And why should I do that?" sneered Uncle Vernon. "Well," said Harry, choosing his words carefully, "it'll be hard work pretending to Aunt Marge I go to St. Brutus's secure center for incurably criminal boys," bellowed Uncle Vernon. And only way I'll be allowed to visit Hogwarts with Ron and Hermione." 10 minutes later, Errol and Hedwig, who had a note to Ron bound to her leg, soared out of the window and out of sight. Harry, now feeling thoroughly miserable, put the empty cage away inside of the wardrobe. But Harry didn't have long to brood, and next to no time, Aunt Petunia was shrieking up the stairs for Harry to come down and get ready to go welcome their guest. "Do something about your hair," Aunt Petunia snapped as he reached the hall. Harry couldn't see the point of trying to make his hair lie flat. Aunt Marge loved criticizing him, so the untidier he looked, the happier she would be. All too soon, there was a crunch of gravel outside as Uncle Vernon's car pulled back into the driveway. Then the clunk of the car doors and footsteps on the garden path. At the door, Aunt Petunia hissed at Harry. Feeling of great gloom in his stomach, Harry pulled the door open. On the threshold stood Aunt Marge. She was very like Uncle Vernon, large, beefy, and purple-faced. She even had a mustache, though not a bushy as his. In one hand she had an enormous suitcase, and tucked under the other was an old and evil-tempered bulldog. "Where's my Dudders?" roared Aunt Marge. "Where's my Neffy Boo?" Dudley came waddling down the hall, his blonde hair plastered flat to his face, his fat head, a bow tie just visible under his many chins. Aunt Marge thrust the suitcase into Harry's stomach, knocking the wind out of him, seized Dudley in a tight one-armed hug, and planted a large kiss on his cheek. Harry knew perfectly well that Dudley only put up with Aunt Marge's hugs because he was well paid for it, and sure enough, when they broke apart, Dudley had a crisp 20-pound note lunged to his fat fist. "Petunia!" shouted Aunt Marge, striding past Harry as though he was a hat stand. Aunt Marge and Aunt Petunia kissed, or rather, Aunt Marge bumped her large jaw against Petunia's bony cheekbone. Uncle Vernon now came in, smiling joyfully as he shut the door. "Tea, Marge," he said. "Now what will Ripper take?" "Ripper can have some tea out of my saucer," said Aunt Marge, as they all trooped into the kitchen, leaving Harry alone in the hall with the suitcase. But Harry wasn't complaining. Any excuse not to be with Aunt Marge was fine by him, so he began to heave the case upstairs into the spare bedroom, taking as long as he could. By the time he got back to the kitchen, Aunt Marge had been supplied with tea and fruitcake, and Ripper was lapping noisily in the corner. Harry saw Aunt Petunia wince slightly as specks of tea and drool flecked her clean floor. Aunt Petunia hated animals. "Who's looking after the other dogs, Marge?" Uncle Vernon asked. "Oh, I've got Colonel Fubster managing them," boomed Aunt Marge. "He's retired now. Good for him to have something to do. But I couldn't leave poor old Ripper. He pines if he's away from me." Ripper began to growl again as Harry sat down. This directed Aunt Marge's attention to Harry for the first time. "So," she barked, "still here, are you?" "Yes," said Harry. "Don't you say yes in that ungrateful tone," Aunt Marge growled. "It's a damn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep you. Would you have done it yourself?" "I would have done it myself. You'd have gone straight to an orphanage if you had been dumped on my doorstep." Harry was bursting to say that he'd rather live in an orphanage than with the Dursleys, but he thought of the Hogsmeade form stopped him. He forced his face into a painful smile. "Don't you smirk time? Excellent, said Aunt Marge. I won't have this nappy-pamby wishy-washy nonsense about not hitting people who deserve it. A good thrashing is what's needed in 99 cases out of 100. Have you been beaten often? Oh yeah, said Harry, loads of times. Aunt Marge narrowed her eyes. I still don't like your tone, boy, he said. If you can speak of your beatings in that casual way, then they clearly aren't hitting you hard enough. Petunia, I'd write if I were you, making clear that you approve the use of extreme force in this boy's case. Perhaps Uncle Vernon was worried that Harry might forget their bargain. In any case, he changed the subject abruptly. Heard the news this morning, Marge. What about that escaped prisoner, eh? As Aunt Marge started to make herself at home, Harry caught himself thinking almost longingly of life at number 4 without her. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia casually encouraged Harry to stay out of their way, which Harry was only too happy to do. Aunt Marge, on the other hand, wanted Harry under her eye at all times, so that she could boom out suggestions for his improvement. She delighted in comparing Harry with Dudley, and took huge pleasure in buying Dudley expensive presents while glaring at Harry, as though daring him to ask why he hadn't got a present too. She had also kept throwing out dark hints about what made Harry such an unsatisfactory person. You mustn't blame yourself for the way the boys turned out, Vernon, she said over at lunch on the 3rd day. If there's something rotten on the inside, there's nothing anyone can do about it. Harry tried to concentrate on his food, but his hands shook and his face was starting to burn with anger. Remember the form, he told himself. Think about Hogsmeade. Don't say anything and don't rise. Aunt Marge reached for her glass of wine. In one of the basic rules of breeding, she said, you see it all the time with dogs. If there's something wrong with the bitch, then there's something wrong with the pup. At that moment, the wine glass Aunt Marge was holding exploded in her hand. Shards of glass flew in every direction, and Aunt Marge spluttered and blinked, her greatly ruddy face dripping. Marge, squealed Aunt Petunia. Marge, are you all right? Not to worry, grunted Aunt Marge, mopping her face with her napkin. Must have squeezed it too hard. Did the same thing at Colonial Fubsters the other day. No need to fuss, Petunia. I have a very firm grip. But Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were both looking at Harry suspiciously, so he decided he'd better skip pudding and escape from the table as soon as he could. Outside in the hall, he leant against the wall, breathing deeply. It had been a long time since he'd lost control and made something explode. He couldn't afford to let it happen again. The Hogsmeade form wasn't the only thing at stake. There's one here. Now, this one here. She jerked her head at Harry, who felt his stomach clench. The handbook, he thought quickly. This one's got a mean, runty look about him. You get that with dogs. I had Colonial Lobster drown one last year. Rotty little thing, it was weak, underbred. Harry was trying to remember page 12 of his book, A Charm to Cure Reluctant Reversers. It all comes down to blood, as I was saying the other day, but bad blood will out. Now I'm saying nothing against your family, Petunia. She patted Aunt Petunia's bony hand with her shovel, like one. But your sister was a bad egg. They turned up in the best families. Then she ran off with a rastral, and here's the result right in front of us. Harry was staring at his plate, a funny ringing in his ears. Grasp your broom firmly by the tail, he thought, but he couldn't remember what came next. Aunt Marge's voice seemed to be pouring into him like one of Uncle Vernon's drills. This Potter, said Aunt Marge loudly, seizing the brandy bottle and splashing more into her glass and over the tablecloth. You never told me what he did. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia were looking extremely tense. Dudley, he had never looked up from his pie to gape at his parents. He didn't work, said Uncle Vernon, with a half glass of Harry. Unemployed. As I expected, said Aunt Marge, taking a huge swig of brandy and wiping her chin on her sleeve. On no account, good for nothing, lazy scoundrel who he was not, said Harry suddenly. The table went very quiet. Harry was shaking all over. He had never felt so angry in his life. More brandy, yelled Uncle Vernon, who had gone very white. He emptied the bottle into Marge's glass. You boy, he snarled at Harry. Go to bed. Go on. No, Vernon, hiccuped Aunt Marge, holding up a hand. Her tiny bloodshot eyes fixed on Harry's. Go on, boy. Go on. Proud of your parents, are you? Then go on and get themselves killed in a car crash. Drunk, I expect. They didn't die in a car crash, said Harry, who found himself on his feet. They died in a car crash, you nasty little liar, and left you to be a burden on their decent, hard-working relatives, screamed Aunt Marge, swelling with fury. You are an insolent, ungrateful little... But Aunt Marge suddenly stopped speaking for a moment. It looked as though words had failed her. She seemed to be swelling with inexpressible anger, but the swelling didn't stop. Her great red face started to expand. Her tiny eyes bulged, and her mouth stretched too tightly for speech. Next second, several buttons burst from her tweed jacket and pinged off the walls. She was inflating like a monstrous balloon, her stomach bursting free of her tweed waistband, each of her fingers blowing up like a salami. Marge, yelled Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia together as Aunt Marge's whole body began to rise off her chair towards the ceiling. She was entirely round now, like a vast life buoy with piggy eyes, and her hands and feet stuck out weirdly as she drifted up into the air, making apoplectic popping noises. Ripper came skinning into the room, barking madly. Oh! Uncle Vernon seized one of Marge's feet and tried to pull her down again, but was almost lifted from the floor himself. Next second, Ripper had leapt forward and sunk his teeth into Uncle Vernon's leg. Harry tore from the tiny room before anyone could stop him, heading for the cupboard under the stairs. The cupboard door burst magically open as he reached it. In seconds, he had heaved his trunk to the front door. He sprinted upstairs and threw himself under the bed, wrenched up the loose floorboard, and grabbed the pillowcase full of his books and birthday presents. He wriggled out, seized Hedwig's empty cage, and dashed back downstairs to his trunk just as Uncle Vernon's burst out of the dining room, his trouser leg in a bloody tatters. Come back in, yeah, he bellowed. Come back and put her right. But a reckless rage had